Hello and welcome to the AfOx insaka, the last one this calendar year. The year has gone by already. I'm delighted to welcome today's guest speakers who will be speaking on two very topical and exciting subjects: energy in Africa and African heritage. The first talk is about energy futures in Africa and how they intersect with Africa's structural change, about the scope for technology and policy innovation and experimentation. Some would argue that Africa is the last global frontier for growth and energy energy is certainly central to the nature of that growth, and not just in terms of rate of growth, but also very importantly, direction of growth, and therefore central to socioeconomic development and how all that may relate to a green future. The second talk will be on African narratives and how they are changing in this digital age, about how more diverse voices are filtering into the global arena and rebalancing the African image to make it more authentic through alternative models of thinking and projecting Africa. Our speakers today, Yacob Mulugetta and Nana Oforiatta Ayim. We're very happy to have them with us. Yacob Mulugetta is Professor of Energy and Development Policy and Director of the MPA program at University College London. He previously worked at the UN Economic Commission for Africa, where he set up the African Climate Policy Center. Yacob's research is focused on energy systems in Africa and their intersection with development, climate change, and the political economy. He's also a fellow of the African Academy of Sciences. Dr. Nana Oforiatta Ayim is a writer, filmmaker, historian, cultural activist, and founder of the ANO Institute of Arts and Knowledge in Ghana. She has pioneered a Pan-African cultural encyclopedia, which we're going to hear about today, and new models of museums. She's published her first novel, The Godchild, with Bloomsbury in 2019, and has made several films for museums. Nana lectures on decolonial history and theory and was a Global South Visiting Fellow here at the University of Oxford in 2018. So as usual, we're going to have 15-minute talks by each of the presenters. And after those two presentations, we'll be able to take questions from the audience. So please do post your questions in the chat box as usual. And first up is Yacob. He poses the question, what direction for Africa's energy futures?
Should I load?
Yes, please. Go ahead, Yacob.
Okay, can you see that? Thank you, Watsu, and a pleasure to be with you all. Yeah, I mean it's a fairly hefty topic. What direction? Some reflections into Africa's energy future. It's really touching on some of these issues, not in great depth, but nonetheless, it gives us some insight. So I've outlined the topic in three broad areas. One is, to sort of explore Africa's energy situation currently. And then, of course, the climate issue has also come into the energy picture, to sort of spend a little bit of time on that. And then finally, to reflect on some visions or some possibilities as we look at the energy system evolve alongside the transformations that are taking place in Africa. Now, just one second. I mean, this slide, what it shows us is the kind of impressions that Africa has created over the past 20 to 30 years. And these are just headlines from the Economist in 2000, the year 2000. You could see that the headline was the hopeless continent. And within 10 years, we've seen a changing impression, or changing, the discourse towards, Africa rising and then gradually moving into aspiring Africa. And then by 2019, some things have changed. Of course, the economic activities and socio-economic transformations are still taking place, but there are also some issues that have emerged. For example, the way in which powerful countries are beginning to kind of take Africa quite seriously in terms of its resources and so forth. So this kind of illustrates the way in which Africa is perceived from the outside. And I guess the thing when we talk in the broader sense, the immediate problem with talking about energy in the context of Africa is essentially the danger of generalization. We are, after all, talking about 54 countries with something like 1,500 to 2,000 languages, Francophone, Anglophone, and so forth, with a variety of ecological zones, climates, rural, urban, and over 1 billion inhabitants. So this immediately suggests that any kind of discussion that we have that broadly talks about Africa will run the risk of obscuring the impressive complexity and diversity of the continent. So, this topic is essentially taking, saying that, well, this is a very broad presentation, but I will, as much as possible, try to illustrate some concrete specifics as well. Now, another aspect which we have seen over the past 10 years is that something like 6 of the world's 12 fastest growing countries are in Africa. So here we're talking about Cote d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, Mozambique, Tanzania, and Rwanda. And then, of course, the IMF, this is prior to COVID. We don't know how that is going to affect things in a concrete sense, is that, Africa's growth prospects will continue to be among the highest in the world. Now, there are some factors that are underlying growth, and there are 2 categories for this. The first is that, of course, the primary production-based growth is still dominant, and it is driven by, of course, the discovery of new natural resources and expanding the extraction economy in Africa. And the second is, of course, the China effect, if you will, or the Asia effect, where commodity prices have remained relatively high, and therefore it was possible to be able to sustain, economic growth even while countries have a primary production-based growth. Of course, the other aspect is where most countries would like to move towards is, how much transformation is actually taking place. So there is some evidence that we are seeing some degree of economic diversification across Africa. And of course, with that comes also migration of skilled labor towards higher productivity manufacturing and service sectors from the primary production. Now, one other aspect is maybe slightly disturbing is that growth has not been inclusive. So there are still issues around growth in the context of joblessness. So more jobs need to be created in order to be able to sustain the level of optimism that we have seen over the years. I'll skip this slide and move into. So the broad African picture is that there are major development challenges here. One is that the African population is young and growing. The second is that we're seeing good signs of sustained economic growth. And the third aspect is also that Africa is undergoing fairly rapid urbanization, the fastest urbanization that we are seeing compared to any other region. And all this is happening in the shadows of climate change, but also, optimistically speaking, the continent itself is not locked in fossil fuel energy system. So that kind of nicely takes me to the discussion around energy situation in Africa. And I'll just zip through some slides here. So on some general points, first is that there is a dual energy system coexisting side by side. We're talking about the modern energy system alongside traditional energy, which largely relies on traditional biomass use at household level. We're seeing some, higher level of, or rather energy intensity has decreased over time. Energy intensity here means that it's a measure of energy efficiency of an economy. And so it is calculated in terms of energy per unit of GDP. So that's decreasing, which is a good sign. It means that the economy is beginning to be showing signs of greater efficiency. But in that background, we're also seeing significant unmet demand, mostly in rural areas. So there is a challenge around the question of access. There's also high suppressed demand. In other words, there isn't enough, not enough resources or not enough in order to be able to satisfy demand. And a large part of that is, of course, as economies grow, the expectation is that energy systems are also going to meet that that growth, and that's not happening at a fairly robust sort of level, and that's one of the challenges that we're facing in Africa. Just to give you a sketch here, so you look at primary energy demand by fuel for selected African regions. You see North Africa and South Africa. The two dominant sort of energy, call it hotspots, and then the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. So what you see there, for instance, with North Africa is that there is the dominance of fossil fuels, largely in oil and gas. And then South Africa is a slightly different picture, still where fossil fuels dominate, but this time, we're talking about coal and to some extent oil. Now, when you look at the rest of Africa or the sub-Saharan Africa, the dominance there is bioenergy, largely for household. So you can see very different types of energy pictures in different parts of the continent. In terms of electricity generation by fuel, once again, if we look at the North African region, again, the gas dominates, and in the case of South Africa, coal dominates. In sub-Saharan Africa, it's a mixed bag where there is a greater share of hydro power with some gas and a little bit of oil. So that's an interesting picture there, especially as we're looking at moving towards a greener pathway. There is a possibility that perhaps, in sub-Saharan Africa, there are much bigger possibilities for moving in that direction. Per capita energy consumption is still very, very low. So what we're looking at, below, 1 ton of oil equivalent per capita. Now, how does that measure against other countries? We're talking about Iceland, which has 18, Qatar 17, the USA 7. So we really are looking at a region that is very low in terms of energy consumption, with the exception of perhaps South Africa, which roughly is around somewhat slightly higher than the global average. And then another slide to show us, in some perspective, is that, well, you've got the countries there in terms of total annual electricity consumption. So you have Nigeria, we've got some other countries like Ecuador, Myanmar, and so forth, Kenya, Ethiopia. What's interesting here is that the US gaming or consumption, electricity consumption in games that young people play in the US alone is much more. So you have there, that sector in the United States, it uses something like 3 times more electricity than the average than that's consumed in Ethiopia, for example. Just to illustrate, how low the region's electricity consumption is. And so what this also says to us is, much higher levels of energy in access or electricity non-access. In other words, you have somewhere in the order of 500 to 600 million people across Africa who do not have access to electricity. So there's quite a lot of effort and work that needs to be done. And of course, improvements are happening as well. Now, this is the kind of the modern picture that we see in the region. But there is also this other reality, which is that, the dominance of biofuels and also, access in problems around access in the health system, education. This is at the bottom there is what you see, young people just outside of the airport in Guinea-Conakry studying, just using the street lights because the electricity is not available at home. Now, energy and climate action. Of course, we know that a couple of years ago, we've had the special issue on the 1.5 degrees centigrade, which is actually illustrating, telling us that, we are running out of time. And this perhaps, illustrates that quite nicely. So you have the total carbon budget, which is 790 gigatons of carbon. And out of that, we've already exhausted quite a chunk of it. 72% of our carbon budget, that is compatible with the 2 degree centigrade goal, has already been used. Now, if we are talking about the 1.5 degrees, then that becomes even more problematic. So in other words, we have less than 10 years before we begin to punch through the carbon budget or exhaust our carbon budget. Now I'll come back to that in just a little bit. Now, let me quickly reflect on the scenarios, because I can see, how long do I have, about 5 more minutes? 3 minutes, okay. So I would say some obvious scenarios are, yes, fossil focused expansion is one possibility, largely because in new fossil fuel findings we are seeing that in several countries, such as Mozambique, Uganda, Tanzania, and so forth. So we're discovering new oil and gas and oil across Africa. So the idea that somehow that's not going to, these fuels are not going to be used doesn't make much sense. So there is a possibility that a number of countries may end up taking that pathway. There is also another scenario, which is that regional interconnections will take place. So for example, we have the South African power pool, we have the East African as well as West African and North African power pools. Now the Southern African power pool is the more active one in terms of energy transactions between countries. That's happening quite a lot, largely because of South Africa's influence. But we are also seeing that at bilateral level, at the very least, in the Eastern African power pool, as well as West African power pools. So the export opportunities for some countries is real. And so the regional interconnections is a very real possible scenario that we could look at into the future. The other is, of course, the more distributed systems. Now, we're talking about still around 55% of the African population still reside in rural areas. And therefore, the idea that we can connect all these different disparate communities or isolated communities doesn't make a huge amount of sense. And therefore, the more distributed systems will begin to assume greater importance across Africa. And the technology and the means and the possibilities are there to for this. Now, just very quickly, some wider issues. There are financing matters. In order to be able to expand infrastructure, investment needs to take place. There are a variety of models. The Kenyan model is the last mile model, for example. Uganda takes a much more market-oriented liberalized approach. Zambia uses the auctioning. Ethiopia, at least historically, has used a public financing approach. So these are all very different financing options which the different countries have used. There is a foreign exchange shortage in many countries. Now, the question then is, how much of our energy system can actually be manufactured, produced in terms of components at local level? Local manufacturing, can it assume some importance in our energy systems? These are questions, that I'm putting down there, over there. The third is that, the renewable energy is subject to manufacturing economics. So the more you manufacture, the chances are the prices, begin to fall. Whereas, fossil fuel resources are subject to resource economics. So these are very different, different pictures that we're looking at. Now, the interesting thing in my view, and certainly the evidence, what it's showing, is that part of the reason why the costs of renewables have come down is because the manufacturing economics is becoming more favorable than the economics around resources. So we're going to see an interesting picture of that. The question for Africa is, can it actually take advantage of this? Can Africa take a slice of that manufacturing opportunity in terms of laying out some in terms of localizing some of that within countries? And then the third aspect is looking beyond lighting. We know that electricity is actually reaching homes, but a lot of that electricity is for lighting purposes. Now the question, the real task is, to what extent can we can that energy be used for productive purposes? That's really for transforming economies. Just one more point is, you remember that slide I showed you about the carbon budget? And there is quite a small amount, that's left. The question is, how much of that is Africa entitled to? The reason I'm asking this question is because the carbon budget that's already been used, Africa has not contributed to any of that. And therefore, we have to ask that question in terms of the future. How much of the remaining carbon budget is Africa entitled to? This is a moral question, I suppose, that I'm posing here. And finally, thinking, still remaining within the climate space, thinking in terms of resilience is going to be quite important. And here what I'm talking about is Africa needs to adapt to climate change. It needs to build resilience. In order to be able to do that, one needs to think in terms of resource use for that purpose. This might require African countries increasing their level of emissions in order to be able to build resilience. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yacob. If you have any questions for Yacob, please keep sending them through, but we shall hold them for a little while. And now we are going to move straight on to Nana's presentation. And Nana is going to speak on creating new narratives for Africa and its diasporas. Nana, over to you. I think you had some slides. And
Hi.
Yeah.
Yeah, I am. I think what I'm going to try and do is show my slide, but speak over the phone, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's
Can you
fine.
hear me?
You might want to switch off to mute yourself on the gadget that you're not using so that there's no echo.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, is that better?
Yeah, that's much better. Thanks.
Okay. So I think that the visuals is fine, but my sound is not. So hopefully,
So your sound is perfect right now. Your sound is perfect right now.
Okay, great. So I'm gonna just dive in. Great. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much, AfOx, for the invitation. I have so many. The sound is not okay.
It sounds okay to me. Can carry on.
Sounds good. It sounds good.
Okay, I just got a message saying it's not okay. There's an echo. Is there an echo?
No, there's none. You're all right now. As long as you switch off the sound from the gadget you're not speaking through, I think you'll be fine.
I've done that. Okay, so I'm just going to keep going. Hopefully it will work out. Somebody's telling me there's an echo, but there's not. You're saying Watu. Okay. So I have lots of questions, by the way, for that last presentation. I'm not sure.
Now there's definitely an echo now.
I have muted it.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on. There's definitely an echo coming from somewhere.
There's an echo?
Yeah.
Let me just try. Sorry about this.
Do you want to just try the Zoom? On the computer.
Hello, does that work now?
Yes, that's absolutely much better.
Okay, so I'm going to leave the phone. Okay, so hopefully this will work now. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so I'm going to how do I go to the? I'm going to quickly just do a run through some of the different projects I've worked on over the years. As quickly as I can, there's quite a lot, so I'm going to talk quite quickly. If I'm going too fast, let me know, I'll slow down. So I'm starting off with ANO, which is the organization that I founded when I was actually still a student, 2002. And Eno comes from grandmother in my language, tree. It comes from Eno. And it was because whenever I went home to Chebi, which is my hometown in the rainforest, I would sit next to one of the grandmothers outside, and they would be passing down all this cultural knowledge to me. They would do a proverb about my name and say, you know, it means a cool stone in the forest, and it has this meaning. And I would just absorb so much from the grandmothers. And I was so used to, from my education, being passed down that all fountains of knowledge were white men with beards. They were the kind of parameter of all knowledge. And so I really loved the idea of usurping that a little bit by putting the little old Black grandmother, African grandmother, as the passer down of knowledge. The first exhibition that I did with Ano was at the Liverpool Biennale. I immediately wanted to not do the exhibition in white cube space. And so I drew upon the Ashanti courtyard house, which you see here on the right-hand side. And I put different artworks in different chambers. I also wanted to, from the very beginning, bring in some of our ontologies and ways of being, the idea of art not being separate from life. And so in the space, there was very much this idea of the paintings being on the wall, but there was furniture that you could sit on. There was a spirit room where you could play music, etc. The next exhibition was The Healers at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And I did it at that show because the researchers and there was a conference, there was this idea again of bringing art from the art exhibition space into life. So into bringing it into these people that were studying and researching tropical medicine, and then showing how does art inform science and healing in Ghana. And so there was Zwelethwa Metetwa's photographs, of course, for those who know, since this has happened, there's been quite a downfall of the artist, but that's another topic. This was in 2005. There was his photographs of healers in South Africa. There was the memory boxes by Abdoulaye Konate, which were boxes that were left by mothers or fathers who passed on from AIDS for their children. There were the healing paintings by Girard, which is these paintings that when you look at them, the demon of your illness sees its likeness in the painting. You tell the artist, as they're painting what is wrong with you, they paint the demons of your illness. And then on seeing their likeness, they apparently leave their bodies. So all these forms of healing that were embodied by art in different parts of the continent. I also did wanted to look at art not just as visual, but really break down the kind of different parameters of art. So also looking at fashion with Hassan Hajjaj and Joelle. And then this was actually my first exhibition in Ghana in 2007. This was already the beginning of the work that I'll show you in a minute about the Mobile Museum. I was looking already then very interested in how do we pass on history? What are our forms of museums? And I kept coming back to Afasia, or what we translate as festival, even though I don't think it's the right, doesn't encompass all that Afasia stand for. And so I worked with a group of photographers who documented festivals across different parts of Ghana, documented the visual aesthetics, the design, the ritual, the dance, the drum, etc. And this was kind of the birth of this, what I'm doing now with the Mobile Museum, and also looking at what different forms do we have of passing down our history, and also of exhibiting that are not colonially derived. And then same year, 2007, it was the 50th anniversary of Ghanaian independence. I came across this man who was in his 80s, James Barno, who at the time had all of his photographs underneath his bed. I can't even remember how we first met, but I was like, I've got to digitize and archive and bring his photographs to a greater audience. Most of you, or some of you anyway, will know James Barno now because he's become such a superstar in the African art world. But at the time, he still was having his boxes under his bed. And so I had an exhibition with him. His studio was called Ever Young Studios. He documented the birth of modernity in Ghana, but also, as you can see down there, young Africans going to parties in London, images that weren't really part of the national consciousness in London at the time. And then I started this practice of research exhibitions, so also using exhibitions as a form of laboratory or thinking. This was the first exhibition that I did with David Adjaye. This was in 2009. And this was to go with his book, Metropolitan African Architecture, where he traveled around the continent documenting architecture. And so I did the research part of that. It was also where I got the idea for the Pan-African Encyclopedia, because I had already started to do this research on different countries in Africa. Again, this is another research exhibition. We found oil in 2007. And so I did, and we had kind of proclaimed Norway as our role model. And so I did a research exhibition on what it would mean for us to really benefit from our oil find, what it meant to be compared to Norway. And so I had Ghanaian and Norwegian artists. I also interviewed different development experts. And again, like trying to show that art is much more than just going into a museum and a gallery, but can be an impetus for thinking, for transformation. And then this is when I came back to Ghana. My first exhibition that I did was on the left-hand side with a young artist called Ibrahim Mahama, who again now has become a star in the African art world, but at the time was still a student. He was exhibiting in the streets of Accra, and so I did his first museum exhibition with him, which is where he draped these jute cloth sacks outside of a museum structure in Kumasi, and then the Saatchi show in London. And the idea was also to bring the networks that I'd created in London and elsewhere in Europe and America and make them accessible to Ghanaian artists so they wouldn't have to move to London, etc., in order to have arts careers. This is another artist I work with, Saraj Atukwe Clotty, and this was an exhibition called My Mother's Wardrobe. Another artist I worked with, Zora Poku, and we went to the Ashanti region and looking at queen mothers in particular, and the power of queen mothers within Ashanti iconography. Zora is looking at her own biography and putting that in trajectory with them. This is group shows. This is one I did in Senegal. I'm just running through this because there's still a lot to get through. This was a photography show. So I found that there was so much photography from the 40s, 50s, 60s, and a lot of it was just going to rot. And so I started this archiving and digitization project. And this was some of the people that I'd started with Willis E. Bell, Felicia Aban, who I went on to do quite a bit of work with, Yacob. And then Anno kind of got its own space, exhibition space. This was the first exhibition that we had. Accra Portraits of a City was really the beginning of the Mobile Museum project. You can see here the Mobile Museum, which is a museum that we take across Ghana and really highlight each region as we go. And so we started with Accra. This was a historical exhibition that we did. This was one focusing on the north of Ghana. Okay, so the Mobile Museum and the Cultural Encyclopedia, the impetus for them started from having these conversations. This is a conversation that I organized at the Royal Festival Hall in London in 2000 and, what was it? 2005? Does it say 5? Yes, 2005. I worked with the artist Hassan Hajjaj in creating this Salon Afrique, we called it at the time, and bringing different thinkers together. And I think this theme was the word and Afrofuturism. So how different of the speakers imagined the future of Africa through the word, whether it was through song, written word, spoken word, etc. And there was such a kind of hunger for it at the time, for this type of conversation. And so that's where really the idea of the Cultural Encyclopedia evolved. What would it be like to create a space for this kind of conversation ongoing online? This is another workshop that I did in Dakar with different thinkers from Ghana this time. There was Billy, who's a writer, Nana, who's also a writer, Kobi, who's actually also a writer. But there was also filmmakers, Anita, and different artists as well, who were part of this workshop. And we did it in Senegal for the Dakar Biennale of African Art, because I also was really thinking about this artificial division that we have between different colonial speaking countries, Anglophone, Francophone, Lusophone, etc. And so how do we start to bridge those divides? It's another workshop that I did in Paris. And this time it was kind of how do we make the archive alive? And so I worked with Keziah Jones, who's a musician, and Kudas Enikokul, who's a dancer, and I'm also a writer. So we really experimented with this idea of how do we bring the archive alive through performance and through interaction. And then I did a series of labs in Accra around design, the word, different themes, again, trying to have this idea of the living archive. These were the origins of the Mobile Museum. I worked with DK Osiosari, who I'm going back to work with right now. I was asked myself, what kind of museum is relevant for the African context? It's not these, huge, intimidating museums in Accra that nobody really visits. But what would be accessible to the most amount of people, what would be most inclusive, most democratic? Obviously, for those who know West Africa, there's a kiosk on every single corner that serves every kind of need. And so I thought, what about a museum in a kiosk? And so that's what I did. This is actually an exhibition that I did with other artists who were also as fascinated by the kiosk as a typology as I was. And then this is actually us constructing the first mobile museum in Jamestown, which is a very busy part of Accra. It was a huge success. Lots of people came. It's the second one that we did. So much engagement. So then I did a tour of the country with some of my team at Anno, asking people, what is art to you? What is culture to you? What kind of institutions or infrastructure would you like to see that culture reflected back to you in? We went all around the country asking that question. And then we did an exhibition out of some of those findings. The Cultural Encyclopedia is, the Cultural Encyclopedia came out of all of these conversations that I showed you, all of these workshops. How do we create a common space? I had the Cultural Encyclopedia online, but then I thought, I don't just want to use Western categorization systems. I want to go deeper into our own trajectories. I came across these knowledge keepers who introduced me to one particular knowledge system, this one, which had 6 elements. One of the elements had 7 hermetic schools. It seemed to me like an incredible organizing principle. So we tried to organize the encyclopedia through that. We came across a few problems, so I'll show you in a second how the encyclopedia has actually ended up. Okay, these are some of the events that we've had at ANO. These are my favorite things, which is the school kids that come in and are empowered and take complete ownership of the space. These are some of the great people who've come in, some of the exhibitions. And that's it for ANO. I hope I'm in time. I just wanted to show you as well some of the, I hope this works. Some of the images from the Mobile Museum on tour. This is a mobile museum in Accra. These are some of the workshops that we did. This is what the exhibition looked like. We have elements, photographs from the 1920s. We have elements from the local culture. These are some of the symbols. We have films showing, etc. Let me just show you Accra as well. I mean, Central Region. So this is a Central Region. This is what the Mobile Museum looked like there. It was in front of Elmina Castle, which I'm sure, as you know, is a slave castle. And so we had quite a lot of the objects in the museum reflecting that. This is a Posuban, which is an Asafo company house. These are some of the Asafo flags. This is by Kwame Akotobamfo, representing one of the slaves. He does all these installations with, yeah, that kind of, and this is some of our team. Okay, moving on. Am I in time? Am I okay for time?
You have half a minute, I think.
Ah, okay. I'm going to speed through in half a minute. Okay, so I just wanted to show that last year I curated Ghana's first pavilion for the Venice Biennale, which is kind of the Olympics of the art world. And what I wanted to do with that, I worked again with David Adjei, the architect, was create a template for what a museum in Ghana that was kind of born of our context might look like. We imported the earth from Ghana, created these kind of curvaceous walls. The curation was around this idea of binaries, which I also find in our philosophy. So I'll just speed through these images. No, I won't. I don't know what's happening. Lynette just opened her show at the Tate yesterday, by the way. If you're in England, please go and see her work. She's incredible. Okay, so that's not working. Anyway, so that was the Venice Biennale. And to just finalize, this is what the Cultural Encyclopedia right now looks like. So we don't have this online yet because this is what we've still been working on. We drew inspiration for Larry Achampong's flag of Africa, his reimagined flag of Africa. Each of the stars represents 54 countries, one of the 54 countries. And so we started off, we tried to work the encyclopedia along the organizational principles of the knowledge system that we had, the Huyewe system. That was quite tricky for us to do. And so we thought, okay, how do we divide all the different knowledges that we have? Oh, we have, what's happening? We have how humans relate to themselves. And so that's being, and then how they manifest their world's expression, how they communicate their worlds with others, how they alter the natural world through technology, how the natural world itself, how humans govern themselves in the world, power, and then how they interact with the passage of time. So cycles. This is how the knowledge that we found, the right way that we found to organize them. And so if you go into each category, you have, for example, in being, the Akan conception of a person, the structure of fancy death rituals, what does it mean to be Inzama? You have all of these kind of different knowledge systems within that. And the idea now is to have it divided by communities. So one of the big questions we asked ourselves is, because it's not just Ghanaian based, but it's going to expand out to other parts of the continent, how do we categorize that? Because obviously the nations are only 60 years old on average, but the knowledge that we're documenting is far, far older than this. And so we've decided to, for example, here, let me go into Akan, you can see, we have these different categories. So we've now decided to do the categories according to community rather than country. We still have the category of country, but Akans, for example, are obviously in Ghana, they're in Cote d'Ivoire, they're in different parts of the continent, and having them by communities we feel is a more organic way of categorizing the different peoples across the continent. Whew. Okay, I think that's it. In a speed.
Nana, I'm going to jump in right here because
yes.
Both presentations have been absolutely fabulous and jam-packed with goodies. And I feel as though it would be useful to let the audience join in a little bit. And if you don't mind, for the encyclopedia, because I can see there was a lot more to say, maybe we can share a link with them so that they can go in there and have a look around, if that's okay with you. But thank you so much, Nana and Yacob. We're not just going to try and jump into the questions. I think there have been a few coming in. We might not be able to go through all of them, but you can have a crack. I think we have just 15 minutes left. And actually, I'm going to start with Yacob and throw in my questions. And they're not my questions, actually, they're your questions. Your last slide had very, very good questions. And you threw them at us. You didn't answer them, but I suspect you've been thinking very hard about them. And I would be interested in knowing about just two questions. There's the one that you're talking about, that you mentioned, the carbon budget question, and you said it was a moral question. And of course, one might think that, as I mentioned earlier on, Africa is, the last frontier of growth. Everybody has been, polluting the planet for hundreds of years. And does that mean that Africa shouldn't? And if it doesn't, does that mean that somehow its growth is going to be stifled? So that's one question. And then the other question has to do with renewable energy. You made a point there that it is subject to manufacturing economies, which is good news because it means that it becomes all the cheaper the more people use it. What would it take for Africa to actually capture those gains, sort of engage in that transition so that actually it takes a leap forward in renewable energy and at the same time benefits as much as possible from it? So I'll let you respond to those first.
Yeah. Okay, you can hear me, yeah?
Yeah.
I mean, I think the carbon budget question is one that you quite clearly what it shows is that historically there hasn't been much of a contribution from Africa. The issue is, well, whatever remains of the carbon budget, why should Africa be disadvantaged in terms of pursuing its development priorities? I think that's the nub of that question. Now, the issue is, okay, there are quite a lot of different types of technologies that might help Africa to leapfrog. The question is then, well, should the continent be subject, to paying for those, whatever extra that may entail? So in a sense, this is the question. We all endorse the need to reduce emissions. And certainly Africa is one of the early ones, to benefit from that, because any increases in greenhouse gases and any increases in global temperatures will affect Africa first and foremost, largely because communities rely on natural systems for their livelihoods. But at the same time, there has to be the question of historic responsibility that needs to be shouldered by others. So new technologies, the investment for those should not be done, in my view, just using kind of market principles, but there has to be a different way by which we have access to technologies that are green. Yeah. On the renewable energy manufacturing economics, I mean, I think, of course, that will require an internal kind of examination of how we build capacity, both human as well as institutional capacity within Africa. So governments need to take a much deeper look at where are those gains, that can be made. Now, every single country cannot make big leaps in renewable, in wind, in solar, in geothermal, whatever, in all these different technologies. But maybe what can happen is that some countries can select areas where they can best specialize in. But even those technologies themselves have got different components. For example, the idea that at the moment, the idea that Sudan or Ethiopia or Kenya can produce solar cells doesn't make much sense, because we just, the technology, the means is not quite there yet. But there are other components that that countries can actually engage in trying to produce. So it's really a question of mapping out those areas that where innovations can take place, where local content, can come in. And then of course, those others where you can have a much longer term planning for them. And then of course, across countries as well, that's something, we'd like to see, where there are some deep sort of collaborations in terms of skill sharing, in terms of, joint investments in these types of activities, crossing borders. Of course, there are the regional institutional means to be able to do that. It's really a question of now landing those.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So Nana, I'll do something of the same with you. I'm going to try and collapse a few questions here and sort of reframe things. So 2 questions. So you were talking about new models of museums in Africa, and you're also talking about the encyclopedia. And what I'm actually wondering is, with the new models of museums drawing very heavily from cultural ways of engaging with knowledge, what is the main distinctive feature between those models and the Western models or the colonial models? Is it more about them being mobile and moving from place to place, or are there many other elements that are actually much more local to, to the African culture? So that's to do with the museums. And then with the encyclopedia, I recall that Yacob had reminded us that there's more than 1,500 African languages. So in creating this encyclopedia, because it's a lot about the spoken word, etc., does it mean, for example, in Ghana, you do this using local languages, or is everything via English? And if it is via, a colonial language, what is lost? And if it isn't, then how could this be scaled across the entire continent to cover all these, complexities that Jacob raised?
So I'll answer the cultural encyclopedia question first. This is something that I've thought about a lot, the question of language, because obviously language is power, language is architecture, there's so much that language is and means and transmits. So the local languages are a really important component, but at least in Ghana, I can't speak for the whole of the continent, at least in Ghana, most of the people that speak our local languages don't really write them. It's much more of an oral transmission of the languages. So what we decided on is that we would have an oral component to the encyclopedia, where we try and do as much translation in collaboration. Like, for example, when we go and we interview people, we do all of the interviews in local languages, and all of those interviews in local languages will be on the encyclopedia in those local languages. With the written, though, we are going to also have the English, French, whichever language is also the written language of that country, but we're also going to have both. I think, in my opinion, and obviously it's one of millions of opinions, I think there's value in both. I think there's value in having the local language. I also think there's value in having the what do you call them? Other languages. I'll call them other for now. I think there's value in having both. And I think there's also value in having the oral as well as the written. And so we're trying to do both. But it's still, the encyclopedia is such a tentative experimental project, and I like the nature of it being experimental. I hope it continues that way. I hope it's never fixed in its mind. It keeps evolving, and every conversation we have keeps feeding into what it becomes. To answer your question about the museums, I don't know if I can say that there's a major difference between Western, because the museum as we know it is a Western construct. And what I've been trying to do through my work is really find out what kind of forms of display and of exchange and of cultural expression, collective cultural expression, did we have historically and have remained, have kind of continued through time. And we have so many of them. We have places where we display objects. We have spaces where we come together to celebrate art and culture, but they're not necessarily within, static four walls of the museum. And so I would say, you asked about the biggest difference. I would say the difference between something being, and sorry to put it so harshly right now, but this is me being very essentialistic, the difference of something being alive and dead. In the ways that museums in the West are often these kind of, mausoleums, you go into them, everybody's whispering, there's a hush-hushness to museums in the West, whereas, like if you go into the same kind of collective creative space, at least I can speak for Ghana, there's music, there's dance, there's sweat, and there's a lot of aliveness and there's a lot of color, and it almost sounds like a cliche what I'm describing, but it's very much that the artworks and how we exhibit them to each other is very much within a forum that's very alive. And I would say the other main difference is that people are as important as the objects, if not more so, whereas in the West, the objects are more important, I'd say, than people. They're more important than the people that they were taken from or that they came from. They're more important sometimes than the audiences. It's like, keep the object safe and sacred, regardless almost of the people. So I'd say those were probably the two most.
Fantastic. I'm going to ask a question here that came through, and it's a great question because it cuts across both presentations. And the question is, do you have any thoughts, Nana? And I'll also ask Yacob to comment on that question. Do you have any thoughts on how to extend the knowledge systems approach to explore perceptions of values and benefits of the natural environment?
Yes, 100%.
Tell us more.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, this is something I'm actually very, very, very fascinated by. I'm fascinated by it in terms of farming. I'm fascinated by it in terms of conservation of plants and animals. And what I'm finding is that within our knowledge systems, as they're expressed through poetry, whether it's in libation or whether it's drum poetry or whether it's spoken poetry, whether it's in, divination systems or, all the different ways that we pass on our knowledge systems, there's always this reverence for the whole, for the ecosystem. We always start off by, acknowledging God and the universe, and then the earth, Mother Earth. And then, if, for example, you're going to cut down a tree for a drum, you pour libation to the spirit of the tree before you cut it down. You're almost communing with the tree to ask it its permission, the spirit of the tree, which means that you're not just thinking of this tree as a inanimate object that's just there for your own use. You're revering it as a being in its own right. And so even if you are going to use it, you're doing it with a respect for its innateness. And I see that cut across in everything, how rivers are spoken of, how animals are spoken of. And so, yes, I think our knowledge systems can be very, very helpful, especially at this moment in time, where we're really having to look at how can we sustain ourselves as human beings, as part of this planet and as part of the natural world.
Yacob, can I ask you to come in right there? Because with all this reverence of the natural world, and then this question of energy and then green energy, what are your views in that space with regards to energy and sustainability in Africa?
Well, I mean, just to extend to what Nana is saying here, I mean, if you were to draw back sometime before we embarked on, this so-called modern technology. I mean, people have used technology but often technology that is perhaps, embedded in natural systems. Just to give you an example, a few years ago, I went to Mali, to Bamako, and I was struck, how air conditioning was used almost everywhere where people can afford it. And then you look around, and of course, what's happened is that, architecture itself has taken a kind of a Western type of a bent to it. And of course, with that comes then that additional energy that you have to use in order to cool their homes. Whereas, if you were to step back in time, of course, in Mali, they were known for producing or having these homes, that cool naturally, that warm naturally, depending on, largely because of the material that was being used. So the question is, it is possible to fuse those two worlds, I think, that somehow we have to find ways in how we domesticate new technologies or modernity, if you want to call it that. New ideas, new inventions are great, but at the same time, they also have to somehow fit into contexts. And I think, that's something that we need to revisit or perhaps, invent in order to be able to serve, to function within the natural system that we have.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Sadly, we're going to have to draw this to a close, and I apologize for the hiccups we had earlier on with the technology, but it's been absolutely fascinating to listen to you both. I have to say that it's engaged both sides of my brain. There's a lot of stuff that's buzzing in there and a lot of positivity coming out of that. And so the year is also drawing to a close, and so we wish you all a wonderful Christmas break. We will resume next year in February with a fantastic lineup of speakers. And thank you for joining us. And we shall look forward to seeing you again in February 2021. So Merry Christmas and goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye, thank you.
I'll write to you, Nana, as well.
Great, yes, please do.
With some questions.
Okay, I have questions too, so that's great.
Great.